Activist, okay.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are just waiting for the last few stragglers, but it looks like people are still coming in slowly. We had about 500 people sign up today. We have about 85 people in the room so far, so I expect a few more will be joining us. And of course, everybody else should feel free to share this recording, and we hope you enjoy the recording. So my name is Beth Schumann. I am the American Director of Combatants for Peace, and we have two incredible leaders in the world of feminism and activism in Israel and Palestine. So we have Karen Asaf, who is an Israeli activist, anti-occupation and solidarity activist. She's worked with the Women's Coalition for Peace, lives near Jerusalem, and is currently the program director at American Friends Service Committee. And she was recommended to us from our program director, our education director in Israel, who, when I asked him about doing a talk on feminist leadership, he said, "Oh, you absolutely need to ask Karen. She's an amazing activist in the field and could speak very, very well to questions around feminism and women's leadership." And we also have with us Naveen Sanduka. I hope I pronounced your last name all right.
You did.
Brilliant. Naveen is very well regarded in the peace building field. She is a feminist leader, activist. She sits on the board of the Alliance for Middle East Peace and currently works for ROPES, the Regional Organization for Economy and Security. She's also very well regarded and well respected by all of our Combatants for Peace activists. So I'm very, very pleased to have both of these incredible women with us today to speak to these questions of feminism, women's leadership, and the ways in which women and feminist leadership are both complicit and can be utilized to overcome the occupation. So both sort of from both perspectives. So we're going to start with who wants the first question? All right. All right, I'll open the question with a question for Karen. If you could speak about the connection in Israel between militarism and feminism.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'll just say that when you first approached me and told me that I can talk about feminism and militarism in Israel, it sounds like really everything, because it touches upon every aspect of our lives, really. So it was a challenge to try to choose. I want to share as a start my personal experience as a conscientious objector. A long time ago, I refused to go to the Israeli army when I was 18. It was around 98, 99, before the second Intifada, and shortly to discover this little surreal experience, I was a young woman entering a room of about 5 adult men, most of them in uniform, and some of them ultra-Orthodox Jews, because it used to be a committee that met both women refusing for conscious reasons and for religious reasons. And after writing a very long letter, bringing with me people who can testify for me, etc., like the protocol said, I sat there for about 40 minutes, bombarded with questions. Some of them very invasive, such as if you were raped on the street, wouldn't you defend yourself, for example, or wouldn't you defend your sister if you saw something like that happening to her? Of course, other questions such as if everybody were like you, what do you expect? How can you live here if you don't want to serve your country, etc., etc. And this is until today, the experience of young women who refuse to go to the army, except today, most of them go to jail. It wasn't like that when I refused. But this is an example of how really the Israeli military gets the mandate in Israel to determine around moral issues. It sets the mindset around moral issues. And I want to give some examples from actually recently to prove how much the Israeli woman and actually the Israeli womb is recruited to the national project, to the Zionist project, and to the military project that this state really is involved in since its beginning. I want to share an image from a recent campaign of an organization called Efrat. This organization is an anti-abortion organization, civil organization that is active in Israel, and they came out in a campaign that was on public transportation mainly. I'll translate because obviously it's in Hebrew, and it says, are you in a dilemma if you want to stop your pregnancy? One day your baby will get a combat soldier medal. So think well about that. And this is, it sounds maybe an extreme example, but it really exemplifies well how the mindset of national security takes over really the very womb of women as a part of this project that is really based on colonial, as far as I see it, mindset based on military superiority, that we are always in a constant demographic battle. We have to maintain a Jewish majority, and we need women's bodies for that. And this is something that I grew up upon in this mindset, and I've been hearing this all my life. So this is one example. And the other example I want to give, again, maybe looks extreme, but it reflects a lot of the local mindset, is an example of an organization called Lehava. This is an ultra-right Jewish organization that is very active, especially in Jerusalem, but all over Israel. This is one of their campaigns against mixed couples of Jewish girls and Arab guys. And the campaign says, I will not allow Arab guys to hit on my sister. What would you have done if an Arab would hit on your sister? Let Jews win. We need to stop this. Don't let them integrate among us. And again, this is something that for me is very difficult to separate the militarism in Israel and the concept of Jewish superiority that exists here and that is practiced via military means. And the women inside this structure, as I'll elaborate a little bit later about that, but first and foremost are recruited body and soul to this project as mothers, as potential mothers that will one day provide for the nation. And in this mindset, being a feminist is a really difficult question, because you can't really separate anti-military and anti-racist and anti-Jewish superiority struggles from the feminist question. So that's how I think I'll stop at that at this point and elaborate later.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the anti-abortion movement tying themselves to the military project. And you could see that in second wave feminism in the United States as well, and the ways in which the abortion rights activists were tied to the peaceniks and the military enthusiasts were tied to the anti-abortion activists. So it's an interesting intersection that you bring up. So Naveen, I would love for you to speak as well a little bit about the history from your perspective in the first Intifada, the role of women's leadership, and also tying that from this first Intifada through Oslo, the way in which you see women's leadership and the evolution of like feminist thought and progression in that way.
Sure. Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much for hosting me today to talk to you about this issue. It's a favorite topic of mine, to talk specifically about women's participation, and more specifically, women's political participation. And it's really inspiring to see the role of Palestinian women, specifically how they changed from the 80s, which we led in the first Intifada, and then afterwards towards Oslo, and then the second Intifada, and where we are here today. During the first Intifada, it was, I would say that there was no difference between Palestinians. What I mean is that right now we have Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and Palestinians who live in Gaza, and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And each one of them has their own struggle at the moment. But during the first Intifada, all of the Palestinians were one unit. Like everybody was under the same oppression. Everybody was fighting the same fight. What does that mean? We saw women at the first Intifada being very active, whether in the field, so they were also kind of taking a role in the activities that were happening. Some of them were also leaders in a sense of leading different groups in the struggle against the occupation. Some of them were also writers, academics who wrote a lot about the first Intifada. A lot of them, they were also forming NGOs who were focusing on the social issues, but also on the political issues as well, and the legal issues. And so we see that women in the first Intifada were really active. We didn't say that there's a difference between a man and a woman in that sense, but it's really interesting to note that still in the first Intifada, women who went to prison, to the Israeli jail for a political reason, were still considered less when it comes to family honor. You know, they might have lost their honor in the jail, in the Israeli jail. So somehow women were kind of like, okay, we are participating, but at the same time, the society is putting that stigma on us as well. Now, fast forward, the first negotiations happened, and basically Oslo Agreement were signed. And obviously everybody was had high hopes, because we had women who were very active in leadership positions, and we were hopeful that these women are also going to be participating in the negotiations and later on in the establishment of the Palestinian independent state. In the 1991, the technical committees that were formed to discuss the details that were on the table, out of 300, only 6 were females. And afterwards, there was an establishment of something called the Women's Affairs Technical Committee that was established after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority as an answer to women who were demanding, you know, we need to put gender issues on the table. We need to put women's rights on the table. Yes, now we're having the Palestinian Authority, and having women's rights is not something to be ignored. It's something that goes hand in hand with the state building. Unfortunately, they were ignored, and the Women's Affairs Technical Committee were formed, which is basically a coalition of 7 political parties. It's a place where the women in these political parties can lead, and it's also made up of different organizations and centers. If we're talking about Oslo itself, as I mentioned, women were completely neglected. And if I might elaborate even a little bit more on also the question of militarization, during the second Intifada, which is in the early 2000s, we saw women not playing a role anymore in the same way that they played in the first Intifada. Yes, we had some women who were participating in violent acts, but you know, you can count them there. It's like less maybe than 20 women if we count them throughout the second Intifada. But the thing is, women were saying, you know, we don't want to be participating, because the second Intifada was also very militarized. So it had weapons, it had, you know, street fighting. It really was lots of military involved from both sides, and the women were kind of, you know, no, not our fight. So they didn't really contribute in that sense during the second Intifada. It's interesting to see what Hamas was doing throughout all of that time. Hamas, for example, which is the Islamic movement, in 2003, it started establishing the Hamas Islamic Women's Movement in 2003. So it's kind of like, okay, let's include more and more women, which is something that they even changed in their charter, the language that they use to describe women from I have to quote this because I don't want to make it up. So yeah. So in their charter in 1988, which is during the first Intifada, Hamas specifically was saying that they have a duty to bring secularized Palestinian Muslim women to Hamas. While in 2017, they changed the language that they used, and we see them using the language of women are fundamental in the process of building. It is they have a pivotal role in the project of resistance, liberation, and building of the political system. So from one hand, the Palestinian Authority was kind of, you know, or Fatah, let us say, or more the other political parties were kind of like disengaging from women, while Hamas at the same time was including more and more women in its movement. And that was actually one of the results of 2006 elections when Hamas won, because actually a lot of women voted for Hamas at that time. Nevertheless, I have to say that also after Oslo and after a long period of time, we have gender units that were established in most of the ministries. And also we have a Ministry of Women's Affairs to kind of bring this issue on the table, gender and feminism. But yeah, I think we can talk about it later because also there's many details. But that's in short the difference between the first Intifada, Oslo, and post-Oslo.
Thank you. It's interesting. Sorry, awkward moment there. All right. Yes, thank you so much. So back to Karen. So the question here is a little bit of the dark side of the feminist leadership and feminist movement in Israel. If you could speak to that, Karen. In terms of the question of how does liberal feminism in Israel on the Israeli side fit into the military structure, and are there ways in which liberal feminists are complicit? So we've sort of addressed both sides of the ways in which the feminist movement is really part of the peace movement, and then, yeah.
So there is a very interesting history of the feminist movement here that has acknowledged for dozens of years the fact that there is an occupation and oppressing Palestinian people, but unfortunately, much of the liberal feminist leadership in Israel has really internalized military principles and is very much, as you said, complicit to the existing structure of the occupation. And I also may say Jewish superiority, because I think, let's say it clearly, I think in the existing structure, Israeli Jewish women gain from the existence of the structure in the short run. I'll quote Merav Michaeli, who is now the head of the Labour Party in Israel, a parliament member and at least a self-declared liberal feminist that just tweeted last week. I can share this, but it's in Hebrew, but anyway, she tweeted, congratulations for a high court role that said that from now on, women soldiers could be recruited to some special force combat units in the army. And this is considered, this is not the first time that this is considered to be one of the big achievements of the Israeli feminist movement, to gain access to these circles of power in the military and the security industry as a part of the struggle for equality, as she said it. And we can see the connections, unfortunately, in multiple ways. Just a few months ago, there was a big campaign of Safe Up and Celebrate. Safe Up is an Israeli developed app for safety for women. You download it, it sits on Google Maps, and if you, for example, a woman who walks alone in the street at night, you could find women who are around you and you can call them. It's supposed to be something positive. Unfortunately, they came up with a campaign with Celebrite, which is a infamous Israeli cyber company that specializes in developing and selling worldwide invasive technology of spying and targeting weak and poor communities all over the world, and obviously has been also used against Palestinians and also against Israeli protesters, as it was proved. And unfortunately, these spots are completely blind from much of the feminist Israeli movement. Nivin mentioned before the Palestinian prisoners. Right now, there are 30 Palestinian women, more or less, in the Israeli prisons, some of them, and as far as I saw from Adamir reports, 10,000 Palestinian women sat in Israeli prisons in the last 50 years, many of them in administrative detention. We have a lot of testimonies on sexual abuse. Many of these women's prisoners are jailed with their children. And just a few months ago, when Gantz declared 6 human rights organizations in Palestine as terrorist organizations, one of them is the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees and other organizations that strive for women's rights, both against the occupation and in internal Palestinian context. And unfortunately, most of the feminist Israeli movement don't see as their role to take part in any kind of solidarity action around oppression of Palestinian women in any context. It seems like it has nothing to do with the Israeli context. And unfortunately, again, this sits on the mindset of national security that comes first when it comes to Israeli Jews. First of all is the national security, the war on terrorism, and this is a survival war. And what's behind that is basically to keep our position of strength and power. And it comes on the expense of understanding what is real feminist solidarity, in my eyes. Of course, there are other examples, but this represents the big majority of the Israeli feminist movement, not only now, but through all generations.
Thank you. So Naveen, the next question I have prepared for you, but there's also a question in the chat box to follow up on your last question. So the question from the chat box is, how did Hamas define the role of women in the movement, and how much attention did they pay to what women were saying and doing? And then the question that we had prepared in advance is, can you also talk about Palestinians' women's experience today, and this term called double oppression, if you could elaborate on that. And just to point out, like, so far in this talk, talking about, the light side and the dark side of the feminist movement and women's leadership, the ways in which women really, are moving the dial forward, and also ways in which women are complicit. And then we're going to transition to talking more about how the feminist movement can be used to overcome the occupation and oppression. Sorry, Naveen?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's lots of questions. And
It is, isn't it?
I'll start
Sorry
with the one
about
in the
that.
chat box now. It's okay.
Okay,
I'll
great.
start with the one in the chat box because I think it's interesting and follows up on what we've already started talking about. So listen, I'm not a Hamas expert when it comes to Hamas and how they regard women, but I know that they also have many women participating in actual military actions from Hamas's perspective. And I think they also look at women as more in the social sphere, like more offering, social services. So if you look at what was happening during our only elections that we had in my lifetime in 2006 as a Palestinian. In those elections in 2006, where Hamas won, we know that Hamas actually used women in social in social issues, like distributing food parcels, giving, taking care of women who are widowed or single, taking care of their children as well. So it's kind of like they talk more to the social issues that concern us as women, more than they would talk about only military things. So that's how they were able to recruit more and more women. But I know that there are also women who are participating in combat. So I think that's also they look at women in that perspective as well. The second question was around what is the situation of women today?
The term double oppression and the,
Yes.
women's
Yeah.
experience today.
Exactly, double oppression. Actually, Karen already, and thank you so much, Karen, for starting to talk about that, about, for example, something called the Union of Women's Affairs, or, so many other women organizations that exist here. Why do we have so many women's rights organizations? Because obviously women, as the rest of not at least the Arab world, at least the world, are facing, this patriarchal society. The Palestinian society is a very traditional, conservative society that's becoming also, using also religion to control women and women's movement and choices as well in general. So we see, for example, women who are controlled in terms of what do they study, where do they study, and later on when they're employed, like what is your priority? Should you get married and take care of the kids in the family, or do you actually want to work? And if you want to work, then you should get a job that doesn't really contradict with your role as a mother, as a person who takes care of the household. And then we also see the level of violence against women is extremely high within the Palestinian society as well. Now, it's not high because we are violent. It is high because, unfortunately, this is where the double oppression comes in. It is linked to the political situation in general. And I'm not giving an excuse for violence, not for domestic violence, not at all, but it is linked. Like if we look at the situation in Gaza specifically, in Gaza, there is a siege, people are unable to go and seek work, there is a very high level of unemployment in the Gaza Strip, and men, their role as breadwinners is constantly being challenged. And if you were born in Gaza in the last 10 years at least, the only things that you know of the outside world are rockets and bombs and wars. That's your experience with the world. And I can't have the statistics right now, but I know that a majority of the population, if not everybody, have post-traumatic stress disorders, and they're still living on it. So it's not like a trauma that ended and that's it. They still live on it. That manifests itself in the form of domestic violence. We heard of women, for example, one woman was buried alive by her father. We don't know why, buried alive. We heard lots of issues between, spouses and married couples of violence. I did this evaluation for women, for example, in Gaza, who were participating in a psychosocial project with an economic component as well for economic empowerment. And it took me a while to write down that report because I needed some time to digest what it means to be a woman in Gaza. To be a woman in Gaza basically means that not only that you are not allowed to travel, you're living in this specific political situation, you are living under Islamic rules as well. Let's not forget that. But at the same time, your husband doesn't work. And in most of the cases, most of the women I've questioned, most of them said that their husbands have lots of psychosocial issues, psychological issues, most probably depression. And they reflect that in the form of unable to deal with their family members and unable to deal with their wives unless they use violence as well. And the women felt that it is their role to improve the situation of their families. So that's why they kind of engaged in that project. And in that project, they learned how to make soap, something as easy as making soap and selling soap for something like 40 shekels, I don't know, a kilo, 40 shekels, that's maybe $15 for 1 kilo. And the fact that one woman said that she is able to give her son $0.25 or less than that per day to buy something to eat made me cry. But for her, it meant that she was able to provide something positive for her family. And you can only imagine the level of, stress and oppression that these women are facing, also socially, but also from the economic, from the political situation. If you look at the women in Jerusalem, for example, how the double oppression expresses itself is the same thing. As a woman, if I'm oppressed or I am facing violence, or whether, you know, physical or emotional, the only service provider that I can actually approach is the Israeli police. It's my occupier. It's the same police who is attacking my son in Damascus Gate. It's the same police that is, sorry, that's an electricity. There's no more electricity in the house, but I hope you can still hear me. Okay, so I'll just close my camera. You can still hear me, right? I just closed my camera.
I wonder if you put your camera back on, then we'll be able to see at least a dark spot of where you are. Otherwise,
Okay.
There you go.
This is East Jerusalem. Hello, no electricity. So awkward. Anyway, so as a woman in East Jerusalem, you cannot approach the Israeli police because they are your occupier. So you actually prefer to live in a situation where your rights are being taken away from you, where you are being oppressed. And that's how that double oppression plays a role. If you're a woman in East Jerusalem, what is your priority? Your priority would be to make sure that you have a roof on top of your head. Home demolitions and evictions, it's one of the biggest issues that women are facing. Where do you find a place to live? How do you make sure that you have food on the table when the rate of poverty in East Jerusalem is 70%? So it's kind of all intertwined together, that a woman cannot even think of political participation, because if she does, she's going to go to jail because she's in East Jerusalem. And if she does, there's kind of like, she needs to make sure that economically and physically her family is safe and secured. If you look at the women in the West Bank, for example, in the West Bank, they are ruled by the Jordanian family law, the personal status law. And even though the Palestinian Authority ratified the Convention of the Elimination of all forms of violence against women, they still, unfortunately, they still didn't make these laws national. So basically what we see is that still women are killed in the West Bank on what is known as honor killing. And we see a lot of women that are being killed and no actual judicial process takes place to make sure that justice takes its place. And at the same time, you have the movement restrictions, the checkpoints, the confiscation of land, the settler violence. It's all very intertwined together. Unfortunately, also, I have to talk about the Palestinians within Israeli citizenship who live in Israel. Just yesterday night, another woman was killed by, I don't know why, but she is a mother of 3 kids. She's a teacher. She was murdered yesterday in Israel, another woman. I don't know, Karen, maybe you have the statistics, but I assume right now there are more than 20 women who are being killed from the beginning of the year until now. And this is, again, because this society is still Palestinian, traditional society. But in Israel specifically, there's also an issue of weapons in those communities. And the Israeli police is allowing those weapons, and it's allowing those mafias to work in those communities. And we see women specifically paying the highest price and their families as well. So I hope I tried to, as much as possible, explain the double oppression.
Thank you. Thanks. So we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit now and talk about the ways in which women's leadership and feminist leadership in particular can really help overcome the oppression, help end the occupation, and help really build a better society. So there's a question in the chat box for you, Karen, about what is the feminist leadership and movement in Israel doing to explore and frankly raise consciousness about racism towards Palestinians?
Thanks. I'll answer that through relating to what Nivin just talked about. I actually wanted also to talk about that in relation to what I said before, and it has also to do with like current feminist struggles in the Jewish Israeli society that take place that are maybe do take into consideration the connection between the struggles that we have to challenge and face. as part of responsibility. I want to first say that as the statistics that I have since the beginning of the year 2022, 14 women were murdered, but this is a raise of like more than 70% than last year. And if you calculate the whole year, I think it's more than 20. I think since the COVID, it hit the roof. But what Yunivin mentioned is also another issue, and there is actually an initiative that's called the Revolver on the Kitchen Table. And this organization, it's a small feminist radical organization that tries to put light on how much weapons from the military and security Israeli forces ends up in civilian hands, big majority of it without any supervision and no transparency whatsoever. And in the last years, according to what I know, almost 30 women were murdered with these weapons, most of them without any certificate or track. A lot of them are in the Palestinian society within Israel, within 48 borders, not only, but definitely in relation to what Nivina said. I'll refer to the aspect of the Israeli responsibility upon that, that is very much known, that the Israeli police doesn't really do much effort to stop this or to collect the weapons or to try to put an end to this phenomena. And it's not only an issue of racism, it's also a political, economical question. But what I'm trying to say is that women are not safe. Also in the Israeli Jewish society, women are not safe. This is highly patriarchal society. And it is also, I think in relation to what Niven said, I think that an occupying society, a highly militarized society, is a violent society, and women are always the first to pay the price, also within Israel. And it will always be first the women who are not privileged, the women in poverty, the work immigrants, the immigrants, the women who are not Ashkenazi, like me, women who are more vulnerable to domestic violence. They will be the first ones to pay with their lives because of this militarization of Israel and because of all these weapons in the military sphere. It's also a budget question, and I think the government's policy is very clear about its priority in that sense, because, for example, 2 years ago, as far as I know, I don't have data from recent year, but 2 years ago, the security budget of Israel was about $55 billion, not including nuclear, because it's not really calculated or transparent, but around $55 billion, while the emergency government program for preventing domestic violence against women was less than $300 million. And to this day, most of this money was never passed, and only 20% of the violent men got some kind of treatment. While, as I said, the rate of women murdered really hit the roof. So we see a clear priority of the government authorities here. What is more important? And the answer, unfortunately, is very, very clear. And I think this relates to the question of like, what is our role, or what should be responsibility of the feminist movement here is first and foremost to take back the concept of security from the military framing, from the Jewish superiority framing, because I don't think that there could be safety or security, not for women, not for anybody else, in a militarized society that is based on principles of Jewish majority between the Jordan and the sea. I don't think it's possible to have security for people here in that sense. And as feminism is not only an issue of women, but issue of healing our whole society, I think this is something that should be related in all these levels: demilitarizing the civil sphere, stopping the occupation, understanding that the part of the responsibility of the feminist movement in Israel is to be in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and to fight for liberation of Palestinian women and Palestinian people in general. This is part of our job as feminists. And currently there are feminist organizations that do this work here in multiple levels. Both what I mentioned before, also organizations that support demilitarization of Israeli society, such as New Profile, for example, that supports young refusers, that allows for critical thinking around the issue of militarization, not to take it for granted as the basis of our existence here. which is a hopeless existence. So we need another way of thinking, and organizations that do anti-militaristic work, for me, are feminist organizations by definition. There are also other organizations such as Breaking the Walls. This is a feminist, very radical organization that understands the relations and does a lot of work with women in poverty, queer communities, which is something that we didn't touch upon, but it's very much relevant also to this discussion. Also because of Israel's policy to target Palestinian queers and persecute them while doing pink washing and present itself as the kingdom of queer heaven or whatnot. So Breaking the Walls do a lot of work that has to do also with the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Palestinian community inside 48. I think that understanding the connections between the struggles that we face is our only hope for a solution, for a long-term solution here, for real security. I think it comes always back to what is security? How can we imagine a non-military security? And unfortunately, I think we are very far from that in the Israeli society. When we think of security, we can't really imagine something that is not military. But if we want to reach real security and safety, we must start to develop that.
Thank you. That's
Can
really
I,
helpful.
can I give an example before the next question? Thank you.
Yeah.
Karen, what you're mentioning, what you're saying is something that I always got me thinking as a Palestinian and also as a peace activist. In a way, so I meet lots of women who I truly respect and love a lot because I know that I think I should turn off my camera. No?
If you turn off your camera, you're going to disappear from the screen.
Oh, we can see you. So.
We can see you, okay.
You can still see me, okay. No, because I have dark side of me anyway. So yeah, what you're saying reminded me of those amazing, courageous women. But so I asked one of them, most of them actually asked this question. So not only women, but also men. So are you encouraging your sons and daughters to go to the military? يعني it is part of the occupation apparatus. And the answer is yes, of course. They should serve our country. They should go and protect Israel, and they should go to the military. And I'm like, you're a peace activist. And but then they were like, no, but we teach them that they need to be nice to the Palestinians at the checkpoints. And as long as even the peace activists think in that way, I don't see that there's going to be an end to this. Because you cannot be coming here and talking to me about, yes, you believe in my right to live and to exist and to have my national aspirations and everything. And then at the same time, your son and daughter are serving at a checkpoint or in a settlement, or maybe they're detaining another Palestinian in jail. It's really difficult how the Israeli society actually sees that and where the boundaries of peace building and becoming a militarized society is. At the same time, I think they in Israel specifically, they don't really see what it means, what it's actually this militarized society is doing to women specifically. From a Palestinian perspective who passes checkpoints, I would rather go and be checked by a male soldier rather than a female soldier, because a female soldier is 10 times worse than a male soldier. Because from one side, she's a woman. I understand that she also faces the oppression from her society as a woman, but at the same time, she wants to prove that she can do it. She wants to prove that she's even better than men. And how is that reflected? It's reflected by treating women, Palestinian women and men at the checkpoints in a far worse manner than any man would. So I just wanted to add those two things from a Palestinian perspective and how I see it as well.
Thank you.
Do I have a minute to just refer to that, or should we?
Please.
Okay. I couldn't agree more. I think that you touch upon one of the hardest challenges that we face here in terms of the feminist struggle, the fact that, like I said before, really the army is in many ways, the real basis of the whole existence of Israel from its beginning. Oh, hi.
Now I'm nominating.
And I think it's a real issue. And I do think, I'll say again, that as long as the perception is Jewish superiority, and I believe that this is the perception of most Israelis at this point, I don't think it's a surprise for you. It might sound harsh, but I do think it's true. This is what allows soldiers to treat Palestinians. This is what allows most Israelis to accept it with total indifference whatsoever, whatever facts are exposed. The fact that Jews have more rights here than Palestinians, it's a default. So as long as this is the perception, I don't really think we can really talk about feminism. I don't think feminism and encouraging your children to actively participate in the occupation project, in the Zionist colonial project, I don't think it goes together very well. I think because the solution should be acknowledging the Palestinian Nakba, the understanding of the Palestinian liberation as something that is not something that should be given, that is something that is crucial for our existence also. This is something that we must understand and accept. This is, I think, also a part of the feminist way. We have a long way to go.
It's interesting you guys are bringing this up, because to tie it into American feminism, you can see this same dichotomy throughout history in the American feminist movement as well. Like the very early feminists, there was an internal battle whether to support the abolitionists or not. Do we go for white women's suffrage, or do we also prioritize, the abolitionist movement and Black men's suffrage? And that was a huge internal divide with the very first feminist wave in the United States. And then you saw it again in the second wave feminism. And the question of, do you include lesbians in the feminist movement, or do you, cut them out because it's too radical? And do you include minority women in the feminist movement as leaders, or is that too radical? And it was a very real, I could be getting my history wrong here, but I believe that the Betty Friedan camp was like, no, we don't include the lesbians, it's too much. We're keeping it narrow. This is about this. And, those in the Gloria Steinem camp, the intersectionality.
Who defines, who makes the definition?
Well, it's interesting, because these are the real questions that the feminist movement has been grappling with, not just in Israel and Palestine, but in the United States as well, about how intersectional does it want to be? Does overcoming oppression for women mean white women only? Or does overcoming oppression for women mean women of all castes and creeds, and also, other groups that include men? And so I think it's been a real question in the feminist world for a very long time, and it's something that's a constant struggle and a constant question. So it's interesting that it's coming up here again. Just wanted to tie it back for those in the States, our audience here. So we have only a few minutes left, but I'm wondering if you guys could both address the question of how can the feminist movement, feminist leadership, is there a key way in which this perspective is unique in overcoming occupation, overcoming oppression? Are there ways in which this perspective really adds to the conversation? Maybe that's been addressed a little bit, but to hone in on it for both of you.
Can you say that question again? Because I was reading the questions in the chat. There's quite some interesting questions, but sorry. So can you please say that again?
The question of feminist leadership, and if feminist leadership can be utilized in particular to overcome occupation and oppression, if there's something unique that the feminist leadership brings to the anti-occupation movement in general.
Yeah, so I'll refer here to a Palestinian movement that started just before COVID hit. and it's made up of young men and women who are feminists, and they were connecting the issue of having an independent Palestinian state with an issue on the status of women's rights and the LGBTQ community rights as well. So they went out on demonstrations, and their slogan was basically that no one is free until, we respect everyone, until we have women's rights, until we're able to protect women and other minority groups as well. Unfortunately, this is within Palestine that they were not attacked, but at least like not welcomed by the Palestinian society. And the nice thing about this movement is that it wasn't only happening in the streets of Ramallah or the West Bank, but also Haifa and in Lebanon, and I think somewhere else in the world. They were all going out on demonstrations at the same time, demanding an end to occupation, but at the same time linking it to women's rights and to feminism and to respecting all the minority groups. Also from Palestine, I can say that the women and the feminist movement right now are, it's difficult to choose to kind of like say we want to only focus on ending the occupation when there are so many urgent issues happening for women themselves in the Palestinian society, as I described earlier on. So kind of like their focus and attention is right now on the protection of women, the physical protection of women from the patriarchal society, rather than saying we need an end to occupation. They do say we need an end to occupation, but their focus is now more on changing the internal legal system so that at least they can offer protection for women. If we look at the Palestinian-Israeli relationship between the feminist movements, it's interesting to see that the feminists and the political activists who actually work with Israeli activists as well to bring a change and to bring an end to occupation, unfortunately, they are considered by mainly the Palestinian society as normalizers, or like as people who are, collaborating with the enemy. And there's no such thing as we're going to bring a change. So it's quite difficult, but I do believe that the feminist movement in Israel specifically, if they're able to break free from the militarization of the Israeli society, but also the feminist movement internationally, they do have a role to play, because they can definitely link this oppression that the Palestinian people are facing, specifically the women, and the double oppression that they are feeling and facing. They can definitely link to that. It's one of the most just causes on this planet right now, because occupation for 60 plus years is something that I'm not sure that it existed elsewhere in the world right now in the modern history. And the fact that it affects every single aspect of our lives should say something, should move the feminist movement to link this political occupation with women's rights, LGBTQ community, and also human rights in general issue. There is a coalition happening between women, Palestinians and Israelis as a hopeful thing. It is called the 1325 Coalition. It is made up of feminists, activists in both Israel and Palestine, and we're trying to have our voice heard and within the international community and within the Israeli and Palestinian decision makers, at least trying to bring an end to occupation by calling for resumption of negotiations. Somebody in the chat mentioned women wage peace and women of the sun. I mean, yeah, all the respect for their work, and it's much needed. But again, do they break away from the Palestinian side? Do they break away from the same historical narrative that we've been hijacked with? And on the Israeli side, do they break away from the militarized mentality? And from both of them, are they actually feminists, or are they just women? And this raises another question. Only being a woman, does that make you a feminist or not? Does it bring a feminist agenda? Does it bring peace or not? So it raises many other questions as well.
For a whole second webinar, I think. We'll just have to do it again. How about Karen, do you have any final thoughts in terms of the ways in which a feminist approach can be, particularly curative or uniquely helpful in terms of ending occupation?
I'm not sure we have much time for that, but shortly, I'll say two things in relation to the Israeli feminist scene as far as I see it. I think that I saw somebody asked on the chat about mahsomot. Yes, they still exist in some way or another. They do exist. They do like shifts in checkpoints and try to see, and they try to minimize harming human rights of people who cross the checkpoints, talking to the soldiers. This is also maybe for another meeting, but I think it relates to what Nivin just mentioned. Many of the organizations that used to be active, at least especially around Oslo time, but still also today, women that call for peace in Israel, etc. It always comes to the question of how much are you willing to change the status quo? And what it means is how much are you willing to give up some privileges of power that you were gained, not necessarily by choice, but just being born to this specific side. Are you willing to challenge that? Are you willing to acknowledge that? And many of them, no, they're not willing to do so. And I think this is a crucial point. And the organizations or the activists that do realize that it comes together, these are the ones who make the changes as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing is, without getting into issues of normalization, etc., I would say that I don't think there should be a correlation. I mean, I don't think I've seen many times, peace activists, feminist activists disappointed because Palestinian activists didn't want to work with them because of the political complexities, because of the political situation. And while I understand that it doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel nice, I don't think our struggle should be totally related to that. We have our own responsibility that we should take. We have our own role. Whether Palestinian organizations wish to collaborate with us or not, whether it feels like the right thing for them or not, they have their own struggle. We have our own responsibility, and we should do what's in our power and what's in our responsibility to do. One last thing I'll say that I wish, and this is part of what my job is at the moment as well, is that the feminist movement in Israel would do more about the Israeli military industry, about the Israeli military export industry that has very much to do with the occupation and has very much to do with their conversation. And again, I think it's related to the feminist movement. It's another blind spot, the feminist movement, most part at the moment, but I think it's a crucial thing that we should start to talk about more.
Thank you. And thank you both so much for being our speakers today. We're so grateful to have you. Two incredible thought leaders in this community. So thank you. So a couple wrap up notes. First, thank you everyone for coming and spending so much of your time with us today. We have a couple more. Well, first, actually, I want to address one thing in terms of combatants for peace. Something you said, Naveen, about peace activists. On Saturday, they go to a protest, and on Sunday, they stand at a checkpoint with a gun. And I think that's part of the crucial reason that combatants doesn't allow, like in order to join Combatants for Peace as an Israeli activist, you have to refuse. It's part of membership. Because you can't be a peace activist and you can't be an anti-occupation activist if you are actively engaging in perpetuating the occupation. It just doesn't work. So I thought of that when you said that, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm pleased to be able to like hear that perspective and share that. And in terms of, so just so everybody knows, this program was part of the Challenging Militarism seminars that the Israeli side education department of Combatants for Peace hold, which are really bringing feminist thought leadership into activist training. So we've done a couple of 2-day, I believe they're 2-day challenging militarism seminars. And hopefully in 2023, we can really expand and build upon that program because I really do think it's important. And hopefully we can continue these conversations as well for the international public. So just one more bit of wrap up. We have 2 more sessions in the summer series coming up. Next one is a private conversation for monthly donors. So if you are inspired by what you see and hear and are interested in supporting Combatants for Peace, please do sign up for monthly contributions, and you will get an invitation to a private chat with our leadership coming up early August. And then at the end of August, August 18th, we have our last conversation in the summer series, the summer educational series, and it's on theater and theater-based activism. That's on August 18th. And keep an eye out for a newsletter coming out tomorrow from Combatants for Peace about our recent theater activism project and the recent protest that was actually led by the theater group. You can find it on Facebook as well. So thank you, everybody. And again, if you are able, we would greatly appreciate, your gifts are what sustain this movement. Your gifts are the reason that we can do talks like this and education like this. So thank you so much. We're so grateful for you all to be here. All right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you, Karen, so much. That was very inspiring, what I've heard from you. Thank you.
Same. Thank you very much.
Yeah. The
Thank
two
you,
of
Beth.
you are both incredible. So thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.